I was tying my work boots when Emily leaned against the kitchen counter and said, "You're leaving already?" "Night shift doesn't wait," I said. "You know that." She sighed. "I know. I just hate eating dinner alone." "I hate leaving you alone," I replied. "But this is temporary. All of it is." She walked closer and fixed my collar. "You're doing this for us." "I am," I said. "Every box I lift is for our future." She smiled softly. "I'm proud of you." Those words mattered more than she knew. Our apartment was small, just one bedroom and a kitchen that barely fit 2 people, but I believed sacrifice made it meaningful. I grabbed my lunch bag and said, "One day we'll laugh about this place." Emily laughed. "One day we'll miss it." "You'll miss the thin walls?" "I'll miss you coming home tired but smiling." I kissed her forehead. "Give me time." At work, the warehouse lights buzzed as usual. Mark bumped into me near the loading dock and said, "Man, you look dead." "Long night yesterday," I said. "You always say that," he replied. "How's Emily holding up?" "She's strong," I said. "She understands why I'm doing this." Mark shook his head. "Understanding doesn't replace presence." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means love needs time," he said. "Not just paychecks." "I'm providing," I snapped. "That's my job." "I'm just saying," Mark replied calmly, "don't trade tonight for a maybe tomorrow." I brushed him off and said, "You worry too much." "Someone has to," he said. Hours passed with the sound of pallets and machines. During break, I checked my phone and saw a message from Emily, "Be safe." I replied, "Always. I love you." She sent back a heart emoji. When my shift ended, I came home just before sunrise. Emily was half asleep on the couch. "You're back early," she murmured. "I wanted to see you," I said. She smiled. "You're exhausted." "I can handle it." She touched my face. "Don't break yourself for me." "I won't," I said. "I'm building us." That evening, as I prepared for another shift, she asked, "Do you ever regret this?" "Working nights. Missing things," she said. I thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But regret won't buy us a better life." She nodded slowly. "I trust you." "And I trust you," I said without hesitation. At the door, she wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "Just don't forget about us." "I won't," I promised. "Just a few more months, and we'll be okay." I stepped into the hallway believing love was patient, loyalty was enough, and sacrifice always paid off. The conveyor belt stopped with a sharp screech, and the lights flickered above us. "What now?" I muttered. My supervisor, Tom, walked over rubbing his eyes and said, "System failure. We're shutting down." I stared at him. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," he said. "Go home. Get some sleep." I laughed under my breath. "Sleep sounds fake." Tom looked at me and added, "You look worn out, man." "I am," I said. "Don't let this place kill you," he replied. I clocked out early, which never happened. Sitting in my car, I stared at the dashboard and said to myself, I could just rest here. Then I thought about Emily alone in the apartment. "She's probably watching that cooking show," I whispered. I checked the time and said, "She won't expect me." I started the engine and drove home. My mind drifted back to when we first met. "You're terrible at bowling," she had laughed back then. "And you're competitive for no reason," I'd said. She'd smiled and replied, "That's why you like me." I pulled into the parking lot and sat there. "Just say hi and leave," I told myself. "No," I said quietly. "Surprise her." I unlocked the apartment door slowly, trying not to make noise. Then I heard laughter. It wasn't hers alone. I froze. "That's not the TV," I whispered. I stepped inside and called softly, "Emily?" The laughter stopped. My chest tightened. I walked toward the bedroom, every step heavy. "Please be nothing," I thought. I pushed the door open. Emily screamed my name. "No, wait." I stood there, unable to move. Jason sat up in my bed and said, "Man, I can explain." I stared at him. "Who are you?" Emily cried, "Please, just listen." I looked at her and said, "Listen to what?" Jason grabbed his shirt and said, "I didn't know you'd be back." "That makes 2 of us," I said. Emily shook her head. "It's not what it looks like." I laughed once and said, "Then what does it look like to you?" Jason muttered, "I should go." I pointed at the door and said, "You should run." He didn't argue. Emily fell to her knees and said, I didn't plan this. I asked, how long? She cried, it didn't mean anything. That wasn't the question, I said. She whispered, a few weeks. My ears rang. A few weeks while I worked nights. I asked. She sobbed, I was lonely. I said, so you filled the space with him? She reached for me. Please don't leave. I stepped back and said, don't touch me. She gasped. I looked around the room and said, our bed. She cried harder. I sat on the edge of the dresser and said, I believed you. Emily said, I still love you. I shook my head. You loved what I provided. That's not true, she said. Then tell me, I replied, when did I stop being enough? She had no answer. I walked out of the bedroom and sat in the dark living room. Emily followed and said, say something. I whispered, I came home because I missed you. Silence filled the apartment. My world didn't explode. It collapsed quietly. I stood in the doorway while Jason pulled on his jacket and avoided my eyes. Say something, he said. I replied, get out of my house. Emily cried, please, don't fight. Jason muttered, I never meant to hurt you. I looked at him and said, you already did. He hesitated and asked, you want me gone? Yes, I said. Now. He nodded, grabbed his shoes, and left without another word. Emily collapsed onto the bed and said, I can explain everything. I didn't answer. My chest burned, my hands shook, but my voice stayed buried. She spoke fast, words crashing into each other. I was lonely. You were never home. I tried to be strong. I stared at the wall. I felt invisible, she said. He listened when you didn't. I thought about every night I dragged myself home smelling like dust and sweat. She said, I didn't plan for this to happen. I finally asked, how long? She whispered, weeks. My stomach twisted. I asked, was it worth it? She cried, no. Never. She reached for me and said, please look at me. I said calmly, I am looking. That scared her more than yelling. She said, yell at me. I replied, why? She sobbed, because silence feels worse. I thought, good. You should feel it. She said, you stopped being here. I answered, I was working. You stopped touching me, she said. I was exhausted, I replied. She said, I felt alone in our marriage. I asked, so you brought someone into it? She covered her face. I didn't think you'd find out. That doesn't make it better, I said. I needed someone, she cried. You had me, I said. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and whispered, it's Linda. I nodded. Answer it. Linda's voice filled the room. Emily, are you okay? Emily cried, I ruined everything. Linda said, people make mistakes. I took the phone and said, mistakes don't come home to someone else's bed. Linda paused, then said, you worked too much. I replied, I worked for her. Linda sighed. I'm just trying to help. Then stop, I said, and handed the phone back. Emily said, she doesn't understand us. I said, neither do you. She asked, are you leaving? I don't know, I answered honestly. She begged, stay tonight. I looked at the couch and said, I'll sleep there. She said, don't shut me out. I replied, you already did. I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling. Emily stood in the doorway and whispered, I'm sorry. I said nothing. My mind replayed every promise I made. I remembered saying we would be okay. The future I worked for vanished in that room. I stayed awake listening to the quiet. I understood that love doesn't always end loudly. Sometimes it ends while you stay silent, staring upward, realizing everything you believed in is gone. I started packing before the sun came up. Emily stood in the doorway and whispered, you don't have to do this. I folded my shirts and said, I do. She cried, I'll fix it. I replied, you can't fix trust once it's broken. She stepped closer and said, I swear it's over. I nodded. That doesn't erase what happened. She grabbed my arm and begged, please don't leave. I gently pulled away and said, I'm already gone. She followed me room to room. I was weak, she said. I was faithful, I replied. She said, I'll spend my whole life proving it. I answered, I don't want a life built on proving. She cried harder. You promised forever. I looked at her and said, forever doesn't survive lies. I carried my bags to the door. Emily said, where will you go? My brother's, I replied. She asked, when will you come back? I paused. I don't know. She whispered, I love you. I said, I loved you too, and walked out. Ryan opened the door wearing an old hoodie and said, you look wrecked. I dropped my bag and said, can I stay? He stepped aside. As long as you need. I sat on his couch and stared ahead. Ryan handed me a bottle of water and said, talk. I shook my head. Not yet. He nodded. That's fine. Later, I finally said, she cheated. Ryan exhaled slowly. I'm sorry. I added, in our bed. He clenched his jaw and said, you didn't deserve that. I asked, was I gone too much? He replied, working isn't abandonment. I stared at the floor. Ryan said, love doesn't betray when it's lonely. That sentence stayed with me. The next night at work, Mark looked at me and said, something's wrong. I said, everything is. He asked, Emily? I nodded. He said, what happened? I replied, she chose someone else. Mark went quiet and said, damn. I added, while I was working. He muttered, I warned you. I snapped, I know. He raised his hands. I'm not blaming you. I sighed. I keep replaying it. Mark said, you can't live there. Days blurred together. Emily texted. I didn't answer. Ryan asked, are you eating? I shrugged. He said, you need to survive this first. I nodded. One evening, Ryan said, what's next? I replied, separation. He asked, you sure? I said, I can't go back to pretending. Ryan nodded. Then don't. I filled out the paperwork alone. My hands didn't shake this time. I realized numbness wasn't weakness. It was protection. That night, I lay on Ryan's couch staring at the ceiling again. I thought about promises, sacrifice, and silence. I didn't feel strong. I felt empty. But I also felt honest. I didn't know it then, but walking away was the first time I chose myself. Months passed without ceremony. I moved into a small apartment and told myself, this is temporary, even though I liked the quiet. I cooked simple meals, slept normal hours, and stopped chasing overtime. One morning at work, Sarah from finance sat across from me and said, you look steadier. I feel quieter, I replied. She smiled. Quiet can be healthy. I said, I used to confuse noise with purpose. She nodded. Most people do. We met weekly to review budgets and plans. She asked, what do you want your money to do for you? I answered, I want it to stop controlling me. She said, that's a good goal. I noticed she never rushed me. She listened. That mattered. Emily texted sometimes. Can we talk? I stared at the screen and said out loud, no. I didn't block her. I just didn't respond. Silence felt cruel at first, but arguments felt worse. At lunch one day, Sarah asked, are you okay? I replied, I'm learning how to be. She said, that counts. I laughed softly. It feels slow. She said, growth usually is. I started therapy because Ryan said, strength isn't avoidance. Dr. Collins sat across from me and said, why are you here? I answered, because I don't want bitterness. He nodded. What do you want instead? Peace, I said. He replied, then we work on self-worth. I asked, how? He said, by separating who you are from what you provide. That hit me. I said, I thought love was sacrifice. He replied, love is choice. I asked, what about loyalty? He said, loyalty doesn't excuse neglect of self. Weeks later, Emily texted again. I miss you. I whispered, I miss who I thought you were. I didn't send it. Sarah noticed my promotion paperwork one afternoon. She said, congratulations. I asked, you already know? She smiled. Finance always knows. I laughed. This was supposed to be our future. She said carefully, it's still your future. At another session, Dr. Collins asked, do you still blame yourself? I said, sometimes. He asked, for what? I answered, for not being enough. He said, enough for whom? I went quiet. He added, you don't need to answer today. Mark cornered me at work and said, "You seem different." I replied, "I sleep now." He said, "I meant stronger." I shrugged. "Maybe lighter." He nodded. "That's better." One night, Emily called. I let it ring. My phone stopped vibrating, and I felt my chest loosen. I realized silence wasn't punishment. It was protection. Sarah asked one day, "Are you dating?" I shook my head. "I'm rebuilding." She said, "That's honest." I replied, "I don't want revenge." She said, "Good." I added, "I want respect." The promotion became official on a Friday. My manager said, "You earned this." I said, "Thank you." He added, "You've been consistent." That night, I sat alone on my couch and said to myself, "This is the future I worked for." It looked different. It felt quieter. But it was mine. There was a knock at my door just after sunset. I looked through the peephole and said quietly, "No." Emily stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes swollen. I opened the door halfway and asked, "What do you want?" She whispered, "Can we talk?" I paused, then said, 5 minutes. She stepped inside and looked around. "You moved," she said. "I did," I replied. She nodded. "It's nice." I didn't respond. She took a breath and said, "Jason left." I crossed my arms and said, "Okay." She looked at me and asked, "That's it?" I answered, "I'm listening." She rubbed her hands together. "He promised things." I said, "So did you." She flinched. She continued, "He got tired. He said I was complicated." I replied, "Funny how that works." She sat on the edge of the chair and said, "I lost friends too." I asked, "How?" She said, "They stopped answering." I nodded. She added, "I'm struggling." I asked, "Financially?" She whispered, "Yes." I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." She looked surprised. "You are?" I replied, "I don't enjoy this." She stared at the floor and said, "I thought you'd always be there." That sentence settled in my chest. I said, "I was." She looked up, eyes wet. "Until I ruined it." I nodded once. She leaned forward and asked, "Do you hate me?" I answered, "No." She whispered, "Do you still love me?" I replied, "Not the way you want." She cried softly and said, "I was stupid." I said, "You were selfish." She nodded. "I know." She asked, "Can we start over?" I shook my head. "I can't." She wiped her face and said, "I don't recognize my life anymore." I said, "Neither did I that night." She whispered, "I'm so sorry." I replied, "I believe you." She looked at me and said, "Why are you so calm?" I answered, "Because I already broke." She swallowed. She stood and said, "I didn't come for money." I said, "I know." She added, "I came because I lost everything else." I replied, "I understand." She hesitated near the door and asked, "Do you forgive me?" I thought for a moment and said, "I'm working on it." She nodded slowly. Tears fell again as she said, "I never thought I'd be here." I replied, "Karma doesn't rush." She looked confused. I added, "It waits." She reached out, then stopped herself. "I won't touch you," she said. "Thank you," I replied. She opened the door and turned back. "I really did love you," she said. I answered, "I know." She left crying. I closed the door and leaned against it. My chest felt heavy, but my hands were steady. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. For the first time, her pain wasn't my responsibility. I stood alone in my apartment and said quietly, "I'm free." I felt it before anyone said anything. My shoulders stayed back. My voice didn't rush. At work, Mark watched me sign reports and said, "You're different." I replied, "I'm rested." He smirked. "More than that." Another coworker said, "You handle pressure better now." I answered, "I stopped fighting ghosts." During lunch, someone joked, "You're calm for a guy with your workload." I said, "I only carry what's mine." Mark nodded like he understood. My phone buzzed later that day. Emily's name lit up the screen. I stared at it and said quietly, "Not today." I let it ring. The phone went silent. So did the pull in my chest. The courthouse smelled like old paper and coffee. Nathan adjusted his tie and said, "This will be quick." I asked, "Anything I should expect?" He replied, finality. I nodded. Emily sat across the room. She looked smaller. She stood when she saw me and said, "Hi." I replied, "Hello." She waited for more. Nothing came. Nathan leaned toward me and whispered, "You ready?" I said, "Yes." Inside the courtroom, the judge spoke plainly. "Any objections?" Nathan said, "None." Emily's lawyer said, "No, Your Honor." Emily glanced at me and whispered, "Please." I didn't respond. The judge said, "Marriage dissolved." The gavel tapped once. Outside, Emily rushed toward me and said, "You didn't even look at me." I answered, "I heard everything I needed months ago." She cried, "I'm still here." I replied, "I moved on." She grabbed my sleeve. Nathan stepped forward and said, "Give him space." Emily let go and said, "How can you be so cold?" I answered calmly, "I'm not cold. I'm done." She shook her head. "You promised forever." I said, "Forever requires trust." She whispered, "I regret everything." I replied, "Regret doesn't rewrite choices." Her voice cracked. "Wasn't I worth fighting for?" I looked at her and said, "I fought until there was nothing left." She broke down on the courthouse steps. People stared. I didn't. Nathan said quietly, "You handled that well." I asked, "Is it over?" He replied, "Legally and emotionally, if you let it be." I said, "I already did." As we walked away, Emily called my name. I didn't turn. At work the next day, Mark said, "Court went okay?" I answered, "It ended." He clapped my shoulder. "Proud of you." Later, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I knew anyway. I declined the call. I sat at my desk and realized something simple. I never wanted her to suffer. I wanted myself to heal. Revenge had never been the goal. Peace was. I noticed the change in small moments. I woke up early without dread. I made my bed. I chose what mattered. At work, Sarah looked at me and said, "You seem grounded." I replied, "I stopped running." She smiled. "From what?" I answered, "From myself." We sat across from each other reviewing numbers, but the silence felt easy. She said, "You don't talk about the past much." I replied, "I learned from it." She asked, "Does it still hurt?" I said, "Sometimes." She nodded. Scars mean healing happened. I took a deep breath and said, "Betrayal didn't ruin me." She looked up. "What did it do?" "It reshaped me," I replied. "It forced honesty." She said, "That takes strength." I shook my head. It took survival first. Later that week, I drove back to the warehouse. Mark leaned against a pallet and said, "Didn't think you'd visit." "I needed closure," I replied. He laughed. "From boxes?" "From pain," I said. We walked the floor together. Mark asked, "You still angry?" I answered, "No." He raised an eyebrow. I added, "Anger burns fast. Discipline lasts." He nodded slowly. "Pain can be fuel." "That's what I learned," I said. Before leaving, I pulled my wedding ring from my pocket. Mark noticed and said, "You sure?" I replied, "I've been sure for a while." I tossed it into the trash bin. It landed without sound. That night, Sarah asked, "Do you believe in love still?" I said, "Yes." She smiled. "That surprises me." I replied, "Love isn't the problem." She asked, "Then what is?" "People lying to themselves," I answered. She leaned back and said, "You're not afraid to be alone." I replied, "I learned how." She said, "That's rare." I said, "It was earned." I thought about Emily less. Not because I forgot. Because I forgave myself. One evening, Sarah said, "I like talking to you." I replied, "I like the honesty." She nodded. "No pressure." "None," I agreed. At home, I stood in front of the mirror and said quietly, "You survived." My reflection didn't argue. I understood something important then. I didn't need someone to complete me. I needed myself to be whole. Love might return someday. If it does, I'll meet it as a man who knows his worth. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Emily's name flashed across the screen. I picked it up slowly. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me." I stared at it, thumb hovering. I didn't reply. I set the phone down. A quiet peace settled over me. Later, Sarah asked, "Everything okay?" I said, "It's fine." She didn't press. She never did. I thought about the past. About promises, sacrifices, sleepless nights, and empty words. About the betrayal that could have broken me. I realized justice isn't always loud. It doesn't require confrontation. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the choices you make for yourself. I chose to heal. I chose to move on. Mark noticed the change at work. He said, "You seem lighter." I replied, "I finally am." He smiled. I didn't need more than that. Emily sent another message a week later. "I hope you're happy. I was wrong." I read it twice. I didn't answer. I felt nothing toward her, not anger, not longing. Only understanding. I forgave her silently. For my own peace, not hers. I went back to the warehouse once more. Mark asked, "You ever miss it?" I said, "I miss what it taught me." He raised an eyebrow. I added, "Pain can be fuel if you let it." He nodded slowly. At home, I took off my old watch and wedding ring. I placed them on the counter and looked at them. "They're just objects," I whispered. "They don't define me." I put them in a box and slid it into a drawer. I sat on the couch, feeling the quiet. The apartment smelled like freedom. The past lingered but didn't control me. I understood that dignity isn't loud. It's quiet, deliberate, and unshakable. I called Ryan and said, "I'm okay." He replied, "You always were, eventually." I laughed softly. It took time. I thought about Emily one last time. Not with anger. Not with longing. With acceptance. She was part of my past, not my future. I texted Sarah, "Want to grab coffee later?" She replied, "Sure." I smiled. Later, standing by the window, I looked at the city lights. They didn't shine for anyone in particular. They were there, steady and calm. I realized my life could be the same. Quiet strength doesn't come from hurting others. It comes from surviving, growing, and choosing yourself. I breathed in slowly and whispered, "I didn't lose her that night. I found myself." The city continued below me. I stood taller than I had before. I had survived betrayal. I had survived heartbreak. And for the first time, I was free.